They laughed. At first, that's all they did. German troops on the Eastern Front would watch the night sky and scoff. Wooden planes? Open cockpits? Women at the controls? Impossible. Let them fly their toys, one officer sneered. They'll be shot down before they reach the front. But within months, those same soldiers would learn to whisper a new name, Nachthexen, the night witches. Not out of mockery this time, but fear. These witches didn't arrive with the roar of engines. They came with silence, a whisper in the dark before fire bloomed on the horizon. To the Germans, it sounded like the sweep of broomsticks cutting through the air. And by the time they looked up, it was already too late. The Night Witches were real, an all-female Soviet bomber regiment, formed in 1942 under the shadow of disaster. Hitler's armies had driven deep into Soviet territory. Moscow was threatened, Stalingrad surrounded. Every man was needed at the front. But one woman, a pilot named Marina Raskova, known across the USSR as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, refused to accept that war was a man's domain. She petitioned Stalin directly, demanding that women be allowed to fight in the skies. And against all tradition, Stalin agreed. 3 all-female air regiments were born, one destined to terrify the Wehrmacht like no other, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were students, teachers, and factory workers, barely out of their teens. They learned to fly in rickety biplanes made of wood and canvas, aircraft so outdated that even Soviet male pilots refused to use them. Their planes could barely carry 2 bombs. No radios. No armor. Not even parachutes, they were too light to handle the weight. To the Germans, it was a joke. But to the women who flew them, it was survival. At night, the P-2 biplanes rose from crude airstrips, their engines sputtering against the cold, and vanished into the darkness. They navigated by the stars, by instinct, by the faint glimmer of moonlight on rivers and forests. Every mission meant flying low, dodging flak, and dropping bombs with nothing but courage to guide them home. And when the first explosions began to thunder behind German lines, the laughter stopped. The Night Witches had arrived, and before long, even the most seasoned German soldiers would rather face a tank than hear the whisper of those wings in the night. In the winter of 1941, the Soviet Union was bleeding. The German advance had crushed entire divisions, cities burned, and factories worked day and night just to keep the Red Army alive. Amid the chaos, one voice rose above the noise of despair, a voice that belonged to a woman. Her name was Marina Raskova. To the public, she was already a legend, a record-breaking aviator, the first woman in the Soviet Air Force to become a navigator instructor, a national hero known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. But Raskova was not content with medals. She wanted women to fight. Letters had flooded her desk, from girls, students, even schoolteachers, begging to join the war effort. "We can fly," they wrote. "Let us defend our country." Raskova gathered those pleas and carried them straight to the Kremlin. In late 1941, Joseph Stalin gave an unprecedented order, the creation of 3 all-female air regiments, fighters, bombers, and night bombers. One of them would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, commanded by Raskova herself. Recruitment began immediately. Hundreds of women answered the call, many barely 18. They arrived in ill-fitting uniforms designed for men, sleeves rolled up, boots stuffed with newspaper. The training grounds at Engels, near the Volga River, were cold, muddy, and merciless. But these young women learned fast. They had to. Every day the front moved closer. Their instructors taught them navigation by map and moonlight, bombing by stopwatch, and survival by instinct. Failure meant death. Their aircraft were an insult to modern aviation, the Polikarpov P-2, a 2-seat biplane made of plywood and fabric. Originally designed for crop dusting, it was slow, fragile, and obsolete. Yet it was all the Soviet Air Force could spare for the women. The men joked, if the enemy doesn't shoot them down, the mosquitoes will. But Raskova saw something else in those flimsy machines, an advantage hidden in simplicity. They could fly low. They could take off from a field. They could disappear into the night. And above all, they were quiet. The pilots learned every creak and whistle of their P2s. With open cockpits and no radios, they communicated by hand signals and trust. Their wool scarves froze stiff in the wind. Oil leaked, engines coughed, but they flew. Each woman memorized the geography of darkness, the curve of rivers, the glint of distant villages, the ghostly shapes of forests below. They trained to glide with engines off, to bomb silently, to vanish into the sky like shadows. Raskova pushed them relentlessly. She demanded precision, discipline, and bravery that rivaled any man's. Her authority was absolute, but her belief in them was fiercer still. When male officers scoffed at the idea of women flying combat, she answered coldly, "They will earn your respect in fire." By the spring of 1942, the regiment was ready for the front. They painted their aircraft with red stars and crude camouflage. They carried 2 bombs each, no more, and the courage to deliver them. Before departure, Raskova addressed her unit one last time. Her voice carried across the airfield, "You are the daughters of our motherland. Tonight, you will fly not for glory, but for survival. The enemy believes you are weak. Show them what Soviet women can do." That night, the first squadron lifted off into the blackness. The cold bit their faces, frost glazed their goggles, but their hearts burned steady. They had no radar, no guns, and no escort. Only each other. Below them stretched a continent on fire, and ahead, the soundless frontier of war. Their first mission began under a moon like thin glass, hanging low over the Caucasus foothills. The night air was brittle and still. The P-2 biplanes, patched with tape and cloth, shuddered as the engine strained against the cold. Inside each open cockpit sat 2 women, pilot and navigator, bundled in men's flight suits several sizes too large, hands stiff on the controls. The ground crew waved, a few crossed themselves. Then the planes lifted one by one into the dark, their engines fading until the airfield was swallowed by silence. The targets that night were German supply depots near the Don River. The women flew at treetop height to avoid detection. They had no radios, only prearranged signals. 1 waggle of the wings meant ready, 2 meant turn. Below, the faint glint of the river was their only compass. The moon hid behind clouds, and for a moment the entire world was black. They flew by feel, by heartbeat. When the first German searchlights stabbed the sky, the squadron split apart exactly as trained. 2 planes climbed to draw the beams and flak away, their engines roaring as tracer fire erupted around them. The third plane cut its engine completely and glided silently forward, the wind whispering through the wires. The navigator leaned out, eyes fixed on the darkness below. Then, 2 bombs released. A heartbeat later, the night exploded. Flames rolled upward, then vanished just as quickly. The pilot restarted the engine, pulling up into the clouds. Behind them, the German soldiers shouted in confusion. They never heard the plane that killed their sleep. By dawn, the women returned to base, exhausted and trembling, faces blackened with smoke. Their hands shook as they poured tea from tin cups. They had completed their first mission, and they would fly again that night. The 588th learned fast. Each crew flew up to 8 sorties in a single shift, dropping small bombs on bridges, convoys, and ammunition stores. They called it harassment bombing, but to the enemy it felt like a haunting. German reports began to circulate describing an invisible threat, biplanes that came out of nowhere, too slow for fighters to catch, too silent for radar to find. Soldiers began to speak of witches riding the wind. To them, the soft rustle of the P2's canvas wings sounded like broomsticks sweeping the sky. The women's tactics grew bolder. They flew so low that sometimes treetops brushed their landing gear. Anti-aircraft shells burst above them, but the lightweight planes often escaped unharmed. Shrapnel tore through fabric instead of detonating. The danger was constant: engine fires, frozen fuel lines, sudden flares from German searchlights. Many missions ended with forced landings in open fields, the crews pushing their planes out of sight before sunrise. Yet every night they returned to the air. They carried no parachutes, the planes couldn't bear the weight. Their safety was in precision and trust. A single mistake meant burning alive. Still, they laughed between flights, swapping gloves, mending rips in their uniforms. They painted tiny stars under their cockpits for each successful mission. Soon, entire German divisions altered routines because of them. Troops slept underground. Ammunition trucks traveled only by day. Commanders offered the Iron Cross to any pilot who could shoot down a night witch. Few ever succeeded. The P-2s were simply too small, too nimble, too invisible. By the end of that summer, the 588th Regiment had earned its reputation. From the Black Sea to the Volga, the whisper of engines in the night became the sound of dread. What began as a symbol of weakness had become a weapon of psychological warfare. And as the long nights of 1942 deepened, the laughter that once followed those wooden planes was gone, replaced by the silence of fear. By the autumn of 1942, the Germans had stopped laughing. The laughter had turned into sleepless nights and twitching nerves. Soldiers on the front began to dread the setting sun. As darkness fell, they would scan the sky and listen, not for the roar of engines, but for something softer, more sinister. A whisper of fabric against air, a faint sigh drifting over the trenches. Then, somewhere in the distance, a dull thud. Another. Then the sky burned. Rumors spread faster than bullets. The Germans began calling them Nachthexen, night witches. Some swore the women could see in the dark, that they used potions or dark magic to navigate the clouds. Others insisted they had been trained by devils, that they could turn invisible to radar. A few soldiers prayed before nightfall, clutching crosses and muttering that no human could fly like that. In truth, the night witches' only magic was skill, courage, and absolute silence. The regiment had refined its tactics into art. A squadron of 3 would approach the target together. The first 2, flying higher, would switch on their engines and circle to attract the searchlights and flak. The third would glide in low, engine off, almost invisible. Bombs dropped, engines restarted, and all 3 would scatter before the Germans could react. They worked like clockwork, no radios, only instinct and precision. Their teamwork was so perfect that even veteran male pilots marveled at their discipline. The German defenses tried everything to stop them. They set up searchlight grids, stationed anti-aircraft guns near supply depots, even deployed night fighters. But the P-2 was too slow and too small. German Messerschmitts would often stall trying to match their speed. The Soviet pilots joked that the only way to shoot down a night witch was to crash into her. Still, every mission carried mortal risk. A single tracer could ignite the plane's fabric. The cockpit would fill with flames in seconds, giving the women no chance to escape. Yet none hesitated. They flew through snow, through fog, through storms so violent that compasses spun uselessly. Their engines coughed, their fingers froze, and still they went. When the Germans moved their supply lines deeper into forests, the night witches followed, dropping bombs from treetop height. The enemy began to fear sleep itself. German intelligence reported entire units unable to rest. Soldiers would wake at the sound of wind, convinced it was the witches returning. Even Hitler's generals complained that these small planes were destroying morale faster than ammunition. "They fly so low," one officer wrote, "that we can hear them talking before the bombs fall." But behind every mission, behind every whisper of wings, were faces, young, determined, often exhausted. Nadezhda Popova, one of the regiment's best pilots, flew 18 missions in a single night. When asked how she endured, she said, "We had no fear left. We only wanted to reach the morning alive." By late 1943, the night witches were legends. They had bombed bridges, trains, supply routes, always at night, always unseen. Their courage humiliated the enemy, but it also challenged their own country's prejudice. Soviet male commanders who once mocked them now requested their support. One officer admitted, "When the night witches fly, the Germans hide." The laughter was long gone. In its place remained respect, and fear. The sound that once made men smirk now froze their blood. Each soft whisper above the trenches was a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, two women in a wooden plane were coming, silent as ghosts, guided by nothing but the stars and an unbreakable will to fight. Daylight is the enemy. It exposes everything, the ruts in the field they call a runway, the threadbare blankets hung over dugout doors, the faces powdered with frost and oil. After a night of flights, the women taxi their patous onto planks and kill the engines with a practiced flick. The sudden silence is a kind of ringing. Ground crews hurry in, many of them women too, hauling jerrycans, checking fabric for shrapnel rips, warming stiffened magnetos over stoves made from shell casings. If there aren't enough mechanics, the pilots wrench their own cowling bolts. Everyone learns the smell of fuel on raw hands. They sleep when they can. Cots are scarce, so they carve bunks into the earthen walls of dugouts roofed with sod and corrugated tin. Boots stay on, laces freeze. A stove smokes. Someone brews tea so strong it stains the mugs black. The navigator on the top bunk writes coordinates in a grease-smudged notebook, pencil squeaking with fatigue. Another mends a flight cap with dental floss. Outside, thawing snow turns to clag that will suck at wheels when dusk comes. Inside, exhaustion settles like dust, soft but inescapable. Rations arrive in fits and starts, kasha, black bread, sometimes onions, sometimes nothing. When a parcel from home appears, it's a celebration shared by all. A tin of jam disappears across a dozen spoons. They trade sizes of men's uniforms trying to find sleeves that reach their wrists. They wrap scarves twice around their faces for the night cold, knowing the cloth will freeze stiff in the slipstream. Someone jokes that a frozen scarf is as good as armor. Laughter comes quickly here, brittle and necessary. Between sorties, they practice without flying. A pilot closes her eyes and traces a route on the table with a matchstick: river bend, rail spur, village with the tall steeple, turn there, cut engine there, count to 5, release. The navigator taps time with a boot heel, muttering headings. They argue over whether a darker patch on the map means a grove or a swamp. When dusk falls, those arguments become decisions. Superstitions bloom in the cracks of fatigue. One crew tapes a lucky coin to the compass bracket. Another refuses to be the third plane to take off. A navigator keeps a sprig of dried steppe grass in her pocket, a reminder of summer. No one whistles in the dugout, everyone agrees it beckons the wind. They don't talk about parachutes, there aren't any. The planes are too light. The rule is simple: fly perfectly or burn. Command comes and goes in few words. The regiment commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, moves through the revetments with a clipboard and a steady voice, asking about plugs and fuel, about hands and sleep, about targets and moonrise. Orders are precise, emotion is efficient. When a crew doesn't return by dawn, the airfield grows quiet in a way wind can't explain. The others fly that evening as scheduled. In the ledger, a line ends early. In the briefing, a gap opens and closes like a breath. They write letters home in fragments. "I am well" appears often, it is not always true. A navigator folds a note to her mother and tucks it into a boot, to be posted if she has the luck to land near a courier truck. A pilot draws a small star under the cockpit, paint thick in the cold, another mission marked. Some planes carry rows of stars that look like constellations migrating along the fuselage. The body learns a new calendar: twilight to dawn, 6, 8, 10 sorties if the weather holds. They return with eyes red from slipstream, cheeks striped where goggles pressed, hair smelling of petrol and winter. Fingers thaw slowly around tin cups. Someone hums a song from school, someone else calculates drift for the next run. The day is 2 inches long, the night is the war. They do not feel like symbols. They feel like crews, pilot, navigator, mechanic, armorer, moving parts in a stubborn machine. Yet news filters through even here, a village retaken, a bridge they helped destroy never repaired, a train that never arrived at the front. Sometimes, in the thin hour before takeoff, they allow themselves to believe what the enemy already knows, that fear has weight, and theirs can be dropped with accuracy. Sunlight finally tilts across the field, revealing new patches in old canvas, fresh footprints to the latrine, a line of bombs nestled like dull eggs beside a revetment. A whistle. Briefing. Headings on the board. The sky is paling toward evening again, and the P2s wait with their simple faces, struts braced, wires humming in the breeze, as if the planes themselves are impatient. The women pull on stiff gloves, tug down caps, and step into the cockpits that fit them like arguments they have already won. Night is gathering at the treeline. Work begins. Winter settled over the steppe like a heavy cloak. The airfields froze solid, and snow drifted across the runways until they looked like pale scars in the dark. For the night witches, the cold was an enemy as real as the Germans. Engines refused to start, oil thickened into tar, and frost crept along every metal edge. Before takeoff, the women would heat the engines with buckets of burning charcoal or hand lamps. Their breath fogged against their scarves as they scraped ice from wings with gloved hands gone stiff and numb. They had learned to prepare for anything. Every night brought new dangers, shrapnel holes, frozen controls, a navigation error that could send them gliding into a forest instead of home. The wind sliced through their open cockpits, freezing their eyelashes into tiny icicles. Yet when the order came, they climbed into their planes without hesitation. The ritual was always the same: quick nods between pilot and navigator, a push from the ground crew, the trembling roar of the P2's engine as it clawed its way into the blackness above the snow. They had flown through the worst of the Stalingrad winter. Now, in 1943, their missions shifted north and west, toward the Kuban, the Crimea, the Don. The Germans had fortified supply lines through mountain passes and valleys. To reach them, the women often flew in storms so violent that compasses spun uselessly. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the silhouettes of their planes like ghosts against the clouds. Sometimes, when fuel ran low, they landed in frozen fields and refueled from barrels dragged there by horse cart. Mechanics worked by lantern, breath steaming in the cold, before the women took off again. For the night witches, fear had become routine, a companion that kept them sharp. The enemy's guns no longer frightened them as much as the weather did. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, burned scarred faces. A single spark in the cockpit could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Yet they joked about it, called themselves the witches of straw and smoke. What else could they do but laugh? Every mission demanded teamwork tighter than friendship. The pilot flew low, hugging the terrain, while the navigator counted seconds and wind drift. When they reached the target, the pilot would cut the engine, and the world would collapse into silence. Only the wind spoke. The navigator would whisper, "Now," and 2 bombs would fall into the dark, guided by calculation and instinct. Then the pilot would restart the engine, the sputter exploding into life again, and they would race home through the cold. Back at base, victory never felt dramatic. No fanfare, no music. Only exhaustion and the faint smell of smoke clinging to their hair. They would drink tea, mark another star beneath the cockpit, and prepare for the next night. When a crew failed to return, there were no funerals, only an empty bunk and the sound of hammers as another plane was patched for the next sortie. By the end of 1943, the regiment's reputation had spread through both armies. Soviet infantry cheered when they saw the tiny biplanes gliding overhead. German troops cursed them as demons. The Luftwaffe offered bounties for their destruction, but few ever succeeded. The night witches flew too low, too small, too fearless. Among themselves, they carried quiet pride. They had proven wrong everyone who doubted them. Commanders who once laughed now called for their support before every offensive. And each time the sun dipped below the horizon, the women of the 588th prepared again for their endless night, tightening scarves, checking maps, whispering small prayers into the wind. The war was far from over, but they had already won something greater than any medal: the enemy's fear, and the respect of their own country. Dawn came slowly on the morning the guns went quiet. The sky over Germany was pale, washed of color, and the fields were scarred with the black remains of war. The women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment returned from their last mission as they always did, cold, silent, exhausted. But this time, no new orders awaited them. The radio crackled with the message they had waited years to hear: the war was over. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind hummed through the wires of the P-2s lined along the runway, their fabric wings trembling in the morning breeze. Then someone laughed, a small, nervous laugh, and others joined in until the whole airfield echoed with relief and disbelief. The women hugged one another, some crying, some staring at the horizon as if unsure what to do with the sudden stillness. For the first time in years, there was no target, no alarm, no night sky waiting to swallow them whole. They had flown more than 30,000 combat sorties, dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs, and helped turn the tide of the Eastern Front. Their regiment destroyed supply depots, rail lines, bridges, and ammunition trains. They had crippled enemy morale and earned a place in the whispered fear of every German soldier. But their greatest victory was survival. Out of more than 250 women, 30 had been killed in action. Each loss had left a hole that could never be filled. Yet those who remained carried all the fallen with them that final morning. Demobilization came quickly. The Soviet Union, eager to rebuild, dissolved its female regiments. The night witches packed their gear, traded their flight suits for civilian dresses, and boarded trains that would scatter them across a country still bleeding from war. Some became teachers, engineers, doctors. A few stayed in aviation, training new pilots who would never know what those small biplanes had done. Many spoke little about their service. The medals they received, 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, dozens more decorated, were worn rarely, tucked away in drawers beside photographs of faces lost to fire. For decades, the world forgot them. Their story lingered in dusty archives, remembered mostly by veterans who had fought beside them. It wasn't until years later that historians unearthed their records and realized what those young women had accomplished. Their name, Night Witches, became not a German insult but a symbol of defiance, ingenuity, and courage. Nadezhda Popova lived to see her story told. In interviews she spoke with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through hundreds of missions. "We flew without radar, without guns, without fear," she said. "Our strength was not in steel or engines. It was in our hearts." Today, a few of their P-2 aircraft still stand in museums, fragile, wooden, impossibly small. Visitors often marvel that such flimsy machines could have fought a war. But the Night Witches never fought with machines. They fought with will. Their wings were made of faith and fury, their engines driven by the belief that no power, not even Hitler's armies, could dictate what a woman was capable of. In the end, that is their legacy, not just victory, but proof. Proof that courage is not bound by gender or technology, that determination can turn the weakest weapon into something the enemy fears. When the wind moves across the old airfields, some say it still carries a faint whisper, the sound of fabric wings gliding through the dark. The laughter of those who once mocked them has long since faded, but the whisper remains, the eternal echo of the Night Witches.